is it Newcastle Docks?
No, South Shields, son.
South Shields.
South Shields.
And you were telling the story about how the only facilities you had was at the end of there was a shed suspended on a plank.
On the end of a pier. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where the toilet dropped straight into the River Tyne. And
Yeah, we'll cut that one, because otherwise
Sea.
it'll feel like we've got a bit of a theme going there, won't it? I'm just about so.
I can't hear you. It's gone quiet again. Can you get the volume up?
No, my volume's fine. It's just it's you're the one that's talking. Graham, why isn't it picking me up talking?
It is. I can hear you fine.
Oh, you can. Can you
remember? Only one person can speak at a time.
Understood. So you've got to leave a bit of a gap between. So, Dad, could you continue your story from, you got on your first boat in South Shields. Where did you go off to?
Where did we go off to? It was the end of the war, son, and there weren't cargoes arranged, and they couldn't get a cargo for the ship to go over to Montreal for the opening of the Hudson. This was in March 1946, and that meant that the ship had to go light ship. It had no cargo in it, and that isn't very pleasant going across the North Atlantic in March. It's quite wild out there, and so what they had to do is from midships where the engines are, there's a tunnel reads, houses the propeller all the way, the tunnel all the way along, and the oilers are keeping it oiled, and the bearings and that. And so we flooded that up to the height of that, to get the stern down a bit. But even so, when we get out into the Atlantic, we left South Shields and we went up the North Sea, up and around the north, between Shetland and the Pentland Firth, very rough, and then headed out across the Atlantic towards Canada, to Montreal. The cargo was the first cargo out of Montreal after the freeze up. It's frozen from October through to March. But we did what they call a composite Great Circle, which takes you north of a straight line. It goes up further towards the North Pole. And the problem was at that time, there's lots of ice floes around. So these were the days when we didn't have radar or echo sounders or anything like that. And how we went, obviously we had lookouts looking out, but at night, of course, the danger was that you would hit an ice floe or something like that. And the way going across, it was very, very simple. You had every sort of quarter an hour, you would take your turn at swinging the lead. Well, it's swinging a bucket, actually, a bucket on the end of a rope, and you'd stand out and swing it across, like that, and swing it forward, and then pick up the bucket of water and put a thermometer in it, because the indication of a flow is that the general water temperature drops dramatically as you get near an ice floe, you see. Mm. And it did once or twice, and all we had to do was slow the ship up and turn south, because if you're coming south, you're coming away from the ice floes, see, until daylight, and then you presume. And we had very heavy weather all the way across. So bad that, in fact, we lost our cargo because we weren't the first ship up the Hudson. A Greek ship got there before us and took our cargo. The problem, it wasn't too bad, it was a fortnight it took us to get across the Atlantic. It should have been about 10 days.
And
So
how ill were you going across?
very, very sick every day, every single day. I was throwing my guts up and I just felt like death. And the solution for that was, instead of doing normal watches, which was 4 hours on and 8 hours off, you know, the ships are arranged in 8-hour, you know, 4 8-hour shifts, 12
Yeah.
hours, the same in the next 12 hours. They put me on 4 on, 4 off.
Okay.
So it didn't give me time to think to lie in my bunk. I had to get up and
Yeah.
work.
Oh.
And unfortunately, the jobs I got weren't the best for being sick, because it was my job as a junior cadet was getting all the stuff off the brass fittings on the bell on the bow. You know, there's a bell there that you ring. You know, and on the emergency steering binnacle on the poop, that's at the stern. So, you know, if anything goes wrong with the one in the bridge, you can always carry on from one in the stern. And they were brass, but of course they were allowed to go black and shiny during the war, because the last thing you need was shiny things. So I had to get the brass back up again, and I used a mixture of bath brick, which is a sort of bath brick is a sort of rough stone, like a pumice thing.
Yeah.
And grate that and mix it with colza oil and get an old flag bunting and clean it. And that's you know, getting it from green back up to polished brass. That was my job for the first few weeks at sea. And of course, I was either in the bow where I was going up 40 feet and going down for like that, a lift. So I was hanging over the side quite a lot, you know, being actually sick and very sorry for myself. And at the stern equally. And the ship, of course, it was pitching, and because it had no cargo in it, the propeller, so we were going much slower than you would normally be. The propeller would be completely under the water, but because there was no cargo, the propeller was only halfway, sort of, you know, it was only getting half the propelling power.
Dad, Dad, you're just slipping out of view
Oh, sorry.
a little bit.
That?
Yeah.
Yeah. Was it on a? Is it not on a table?
No, it's on my knees.
Oh, okay. Because it's all moving around. It slips down after a while.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Right. So the sad thing was, very sad thing was, that just before we sailed, the chief officer was arrested for stealing a new hauling rope had been put on board, and it was he flogged it to make money for himself. And the police got him, and so about 48 hours before we sailed, we were minus our chief officer, so they had to get a relief down. And we got a relief down, a man called Chestnut. Mr. Chestnut was the chief officer. He'd been right through the war, and you know, he'd been sunk a couple of times, and he'd married his sweetheart, who was a Wren officer, and they were on their honeymoon. And they called him back and said, "Look, it's just a trip across to Canada and back. You know, you'll be home in about 3 to 4 weeks." So he said he'd do it. The problem was, when we arrived at Montreal, we didn't get the cargo back to Ipswich with grain. We got a cargo for Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, and Durban in South Africa. And that started a trip that lasted a year and a half. And believe it or not, that little man, Mr. Chestnut, they didn't fly him home or anything in those days. He just had to stay on the ship for 18 months into his honeymoon. Isn't that awful?
It is. It is. You didn't get overtime then. You just got paid your
But, you
normal
know,
salary.
you were asking me about seasickness. So when we come back, having been in Montreal for about 8-10 days loading, we went down to Cape Town and and I was sick again, or seasick, unless it was dead calm. The last time I remember being seasick was after we discharged our cargo in Cape Town, Port Elizabeth and Durban. On the way back up, we were going to Massawa in Eritrea in the Red Sea. And we had a full cargo of coal, which was loaded at Durban to take to Massawa.
When you were going across the Atlantic, Dad?
Yeah.
You were going across the Atlantic in 1940?
46.
46. When did the Titanic sink?
Oh, I don't know.
Was
that
about 1912?
It's the year after the war ended, son.
Yes, because I was thinking that the technology hadn't moved on at all when you were going across.
Nothing
You were
had
still
happened. No. We carried, in those days, we had a separate wireless officer in a wireless room, because every ship had to carry a wireless officer, and they worked on Morse code. And every ship had to have one of these, because if a ship went down, you could get the message in, and if you were there, you could come to the assistance. So we carried that was the only communication we had. We didn't have phones in those days. In fact, the communication between the bridge and the captain was a blowpipe. You blew down the thing, and there was a whistle, and the captain, so you just blew it and would say a brief message. And that was only traveling down, about 15 feet. And the communication between the bridge and the engine room was by a link mechanism between a lever in the bridge and a chain going all the way down to the engine room, so that the movement, the leader to go from stop to slow ahead, half ahead, full ahead, that way, and back that way, was replicated down in the engine room, and they would ding back that they'd understood it.
Okay, so it was all fairly, by today's standards, extremely primitive.
And the only navigation we had, there was no electronic navigation. All we could do in the Atlantic was we had sextants and a chronographer, and we would work out our position by doing the stars and the moon and the sun. During the day, it was, of course, the sun. And we would work out that hadn't changed. So if you had bad weather, had bad weather, you didn't have a horizon, so you couldn't get an angle, Yeah. So you might go 10 days a fortnight without being able to check your position. You could be hundreds of miles out. You had to be very careful.
What were your most memorable trips?
Well, that was memorable. And the memorable one was when I was on my next ship, because I was on the first ship, the Baron Renfrew, which was built in 1935 in Port Glasgow, all riveted, good, strong ship. Only had 7 foot freeboard. If you can imagine, from the waterline to the deck, it was only 7 foot. So we were often awash, even in our cabin. We'd take the carpet up because it was, she was quite low in the water. But I was through typhoons and everything with her, but she just creaked, and she gave a little bit. The riveted ship would creak, but she was moving with it. So not like a welded ship, which would just crack. And I was on an American built ship. Now, my next ship after I served nearly 4 years, most of my apprenticeship on the one ship, the Baron Renfrew. But after that, when I qualified, I went on the Cape Corso. She was built during the war in Portland, Maine, by the Todd Bath Company Limited, and all welded, towed up during the war, to Montreal to fit the engine, and then sold lease land to the British because we were losing so many ships. And on that ship, we had several things which, in the end, caused the nearly to sink in the Atlantic. We were, I'll tell you sometime about it, but the reason what actually happened was we were in New Orleans and in the Mississippi, and it was summer, but the water coming down from the north is damn cold. The ship was empty, ready to load cargo. And I got up in the morning, went into the saloon, and there was nobody in there. And I couldn't, and they said, oh, all the officers are on deck. And I looked out through the porthole and they were all looking down. So I went down there and it was coming in like a waterfall, a crack right the way up, well, just about an inch from well seam. And our pumps weren't pumping it fast enough. It was coming in faster than we could pump out. So we got all assistance from New Orleans. They sent down fire engines along the wharf, and tugs. The tugs belonged to the port authorities alongside us to pump out, and they kept the water down while they welded on some studs and then put on big plates across it to stop it, gradually stop it. And then they put, unfortunately, there was a strike on, they couldn't repair us in New Orleans. So we had to go out and back into the Atlantic and go to Mobile in Alabama to have it repaired. But that was a welded ship. And when we got back, we loaded our cargo and we were on our way back to the UK. And on the day that King George V died, we were mid-Atlantic and we put out a distress call because we were cracking across the deck from the deck combing towards the side. And a Russian ship called the, oh dear, oh, can't remember. Anyway, it came in and went to windward of us. So we had our pumps going, of course. This time it wasn't coming in that fast. And we made it to the Western Isles and into the Clyde and got repaired. But all the American-built welding ships, Lloyd's Register, then insisted that they were checked and strengthened in the double bottoms.
Okay, and you had did you go up the River Niger at all?
Yeah, before I left the sea, when I was chief officer with Paddy Henderson's, we used to go 100 miles up the Niger Delta up to a place called Sapele, or Sapele. You've heard about the woods Sapele or Sapele mahogany. That's 100 miles up the Niger Delta. Was called the White Man's Grave. When I went there, in those days, by the way, this company I had gradually got into better companies, you know, step 2, step 3, and so on, because the Ban Renfrew was really quite primitive. And I got into ones which had air conditioning, and I had lovely cabin and shower and everything else. And
yeah,
we had the latest radar and everything. She was, yeah, really lovely ships. Anyway, we used to go up there, and we had to take a drug called Palurin every day. This is for to keep us off the malaria. Yeah. It was supposed to be a malarial drug that was anti-malarial. The trouble was that I was in charge of the ship coming back down from, we'd been up to Sapele, we were coming back down the coast. And I was on That was when I was second officer, not chief officer. On this occasion, I was second officer, and I was in charge, and we were coming back to the UK, going along the African coast, and suddenly I began to feel dizzy. And I vaguely remember the apprentice who was on saying, "Oh, Mr. Reddie," and I fainted, and I was out for a couple of days with a coma, because I'd got malaria, and to this day I've got a shadow in the lung that was caused by it. But I just happened to get one. But I was there when Shell discovered oil. There was no oil fields in West Africa when I started going there, but then they did seismic operations and they started to find it. And so we carried out the big 60-gallon drums to begin with. And gradually, when they came in, they sprayed all the swamps from helicopters and things like that and got rid of all the, but it was known as the white man's grave. And it's happily the local cemetery that is full of expats who died there. Yeah.
Oh dear. And didn't you have a problem once when you were trying to leave a side tributary?
Yes. Well, we had a problem when you go up. The Benin River is a very large river, but it's wide and it's not very deep. So, and it changes from time to time. So when you go there, you have to take what they call a bush pilot. He's checked by the company as being people who know what the current state of the river is, because they're fishermen and things like that. So you take them on board, you pull up you put a derrick overside and pick up the canoe, which brings in the guy plus his wife and all the kids and a dog or whatever. Oh. And they go on the Monkey Island on the top, and they stay on board while you go up there, and they guide the captain from one side to the other and so on, as sometimes it silts up one way and then the other. And you can't go right down to the water, back to the open sea, down the Benin River, because it gets shallower as it goes. It just widens out and gets shallow, very shallow. And so we, fully loaded, our draft was 25 feet, but we were only partially loaded. It's to get the most we can get out. So we would load to something like 16, 18 feet. And to get in, we had to go up a place called the Nana Creek, Nana Creek, which was a narrow creek at the side. It came off the river. Now, as we come up to that and join the main river, we were coming into the river's coming down this way. We would come up the Nana Creek like that. And there's a village here, and we have to go fast. I have to go relatively fast because there's a bank on this side and the river's pulling you down. So I had to go relatively fast. But perhaps we were just going a bit too fast. Anyway, the villagers come out as they normally do in the canoes and shout, dash me, and that means give them something like empty cans and things like that, which you can use in the villages, bottles and things like that. And the ship coming up, first of all, the water came off the shallow bit they were on, which left them all stranded on the sand. And then this big wave came in that went right all over them. Unfortunately, someone didn't do very well and was nearly killed with it. So by the time we got up to Sapley, I think a day or two after we arrived there, because it takes a while to get up through the jungle in Benin, the chief officer, the agent came in.
You've slipped down, Dad. I can't see your head. That's better.
The chief of police and the agent came, and they wanted to arrest the captain and me, the second officer, in navigating. but he was persuaded that we could get it sorted out. So the wireless operator got on to Lagos, and it was all worked out that we'd pay several £1,000s or something like that, and it would keep the villagers happy. However, Friday the 13th came, and we had finished our cargo, and people were rolling their eyes, but we said, well, we're not superstitious, you know, we leave on Friday. We came down from Sapley, we came to go across to the creek, weren't going fast enough, and went on to the beach on the sand.
Yeah.
So we were stuck there on a falling tide.
Yeah.
So what we had to do is just keep the engines going for about 12 hours, just backwards and forwards. So we should, you know, she just kept that all the time. And then I, as the second officer, in a motorboat, one of our lifeboats, dropped down. And then I had another lifeboat I towed, which we slung beneath it a stream anchor supported round the boat with ropes, and I had an axe. And so we pulled the lot out, paying it out as we went towards that village, which was upstream, cut it with an axe. The boat jumped up like that, and the anchor went down, and then they started hauling it at high tide from the ship. So we pulled it off and got that was it. But the villagers that night, they had a real ball there around saying, "Whoa!"
Yeah, you're fun aground. And you went into, was it somewhere in Japan at the end of the war?
Yeah, that was, we arrived in, what had actually happened, we'd loaded our cargo of salt in Massawa in Djibouti, Massawa in Eritrea and Djibouti in Somaliland for Calcutta. And it was UNRWA, United Nations Relief Association. So salt was a food that was essential to people. So it was a load of salt. It's for Calcutta. Unfortunately, we arrived there at the beginning of the riots, was separation of the Hindus from the Muslims. And we were there for about, I think it was about 6 weeks we lay there, just with them killing each other and their hordes around us. And eventually the Red Cross said, well, we're not going to get it unloaded here, take it to Japan. So they sent us to Sasebo in Japan. And therefore, when we arrived, we didn't know, but we were the first British merchant ship into Japan after the war, because that was an American sphere of operations. The Pacific was America. And the Americans were in charge there, so that's where we took our cargo. And so so we were feted through the streets as the conquerors by the Japanese in Sasebo.
So you've had many memorable trips. Did you ever go to South America?
Yes. That was the other time on the Cape Corso when we did something that didn't do that ship any good. We went to Itajaí in Brazil, and then up to São Francisco do Sul to finish loading a full cargo of piranha pine, which is used in furniture making in Australia, to take it to Australia, to Melbourne. And we loaded a full cargo there, and every day they came back, and we'd filled the holes, and we were going up on deck with it, and then you put wires across it. And they kept doing it. And the captain says, I think we've got enough now. And he said, oh, no, you'll be all right, take some more on. So when the tug came to get us off, we really had a problem and had to unload some because she was stuck alongside. So we unloaded, and then we got on our way down the Rio Grande do Sul, going down towards the South Atlantic. But there was a bar across at the outer bits. You could see these boys, there were about 6, I think. And I was on the bridge. I was then third officer. And we came to, the pilot in his broken English said, Captain, when we go here, a little boom boom. And the captain looked at him and he said, what do you mean a little bit? He said, oh, touch it a little bit, perhaps, because there's a swell from the South Atlantic. Mm. Well, it was catastrophic, actually, because we came on there, and when we got onto the boom, she went down and she stopped. If you can imagine tens of thousands of tons of ship coming to a halt, you know, we all sort of stuck it forward the mast, and everything went like this, and then we went up, and then he says, oh no, keep going. And but you know, it was it was just sand and silt, so it wasn't rock, but it was still, you know. So as soon as we got over it, you know, the captain was really very angry about it, and he said, you put this ship in danger anyway, we may have to come back again. So again, we had to send a message to the company. We got the carpenter, I helped the carpenter go around, and we checked all our bilges, and there was no sign of any ingress of water in the bilges. So they said, well, instead of going across to Cape Town and then going across, you know, to Australia, to go down the Brazilian coast, down, you know, towards Uruguay and Buenos Aires, you know, down the coast. So we're nearer and keep checking. And we did that for about 3 or 4 days, and there was no sign of any. So then they said, proceed to Cape Town. And then they had arranged there for divers to go down and check round the hull. And they said it was polished like stainless steel. It taken all the wrinkles off. But they said that it's pretty okay to go ahead. And we did. And we had very severe weather down in the roaring 40s, you know, past Mauritius there, going across to Australia. And then I always remember we were really having a really bad time off it. And it was on the radio, and we could hear the radio in Australia, you know, telling about the Cape Cod. So a naval ship was setting off, you know, just to be beside us. And then when we got alongside in Melbourne,
you slipped down.
They took a photograph, and they got the smallest guy they could and stood him up against this and then took an angle shot like that. It looks ridiculous. It looks as if there was just the funnel sticking out the top. And that's what papers do. But it was, I suppose it was about 15, 20 foot high above the deck, the wood timber cargo. But we were all right. But you see, these things all took their toll on the Cape Corso. That's why she eventually, in a welded ship, you know, they eventually worked out.
Yeah. So what was the worst storm you were in? Were you in?
That was when, that wasn't very nice. We were on the Koyan ship, and she was a weather ship. That is, we sent weather information. We had all the equipment aboard and took all the you know, the temperature, the water temperature, the air temperature, the wind, the octaves, you know, the amount of cloud in the sky, the type of cloud, everything, and reported that back to Rugby, and that was for weather station, but we had the maps as well, so we could draw these ourselves and see where the depressions were and how they were moving and things like that. And we also, with that, we also did whales. We reported on whales, how many there were, what type they were, and so on, and what direction they were going in.
And why were you reporting on bills?
we were going across. We were going across the Atlantic again, going down to Newport News. We'll go down via near the Newfoundland banks, and the Captain McIntosh, this was his last trip where he retired, and he was very fidgety about it. And we had this hurricane coming up the east coast of America. You know, they got up around the Gulf, and then they come up. And we were quite close to the Newfoundland there. And he said, right, what we've got to do now is we've got a lee shore here. What we've got to do is go to port because this hurricane's coming up. And I said, no, we can't do that, Captain, because what actually happens is that when it gets latitude about New York, it shoots off at 45 degrees to go up towards Iceland and Britain. And he said, no, it's coming up here. You can see it. Look, it's, you know, it's only 150 miles away and so on. He was worried about getting onto a lee shore. That is getting blown onto banks, you see.
Yes.
But he said, go to port. And I said, no, Captain, that's the wrong thing to do. We can't have this. And he had to call up the chief. I said, could you get the chief officer up, please? And he called the chief officer up, and he said, this young officer, he is saying, contradicting my order. And he said, but he's right, Captain. You know, we have to just hold on. It is going to change course. You know, we don't want to go into the eye of it. And she had the latest. She had a radar that was up to 40 miles on its furthest location. And that's how close we were. We just held on our course, and it passed to the east of us, going across the Atlantic. But that was very, very. I've never seen. You know, when you see rain and storms, but this was nearly at the stage where the waves and everything were getting flattened out because of the speed of the wind. You know, the winds were just, everything was just screaming and vibrating at that 40 miles from the eye. That was, you know, quite something.
And you went, I remember you telling me you went to somewhere in the Far East where you suspected some of your Indian crew had been drug running?
Yes, yeah. We that was on a second trip. We arrived, when we'd gone to Japan, we then went to Hong Kong, and we got a cargo from Hong Kong back to India. And in India, we went in the river, and boys, we went into Kirapur dock. To get into the dock, you have to get into a lock where it's, well, you know what a lock is, you know, brings it up to the level. And on the day we were sailing on it, the ship had 5 holds. On the fifth hold, as we were going in the lock, about to go down into the river and now into the Bay of Bengal, these customs men poured on board, and they told us to open up the hatches. So we got the crew opened up the hatches, and below some barrels on top of barrels of oil, lubricating oil on top of coal, they found opium in sort of, they looked like bricks sewn in sort of plastic, or not, wouldn't have been plastic then, but rubber or something, you know, to keep it all sewn up. And so that would have held up everything, you know, a ship being just held up in the lock. So they had to work fast, and what they agreed to do was to leave it, to leave an officer on board to go down and come back with a pilot vessel later. And in the meantime, to try and find more of it. And it came up everywhere. We were finding it everywhere. And I do remember, I was 17 at the time. I was sitting in my cabin, just outside my cabin, doing my washing in a bucket. And the Chinese carpenter was called up to the captain. And he admitted that a triad or something had told them that he didn't want to do it, but they told him if he didn't, they'd kill his wife and family. So he'd had to do it. And they said that the Sarang, that's the chief Indian on the engineering side, the engineering Sarang, and his crew had helped put the stuff away. So I saw him, I said, good night. I was washing, and I said, good night to Chippy. And because he's a nice man. And he went down to his accommodation. He was ranked as a chief officer, as a petty officer. So he had a cabin on the poop, the stern, with the Indians down below. Anyway, we went out into the Bay of Bengal. We dropped the pilot, we dropped the custom man, and they said, if you find any more, they'll be in touch with the customs at Hong Kong, because that's where we were going to discharge, and then take it from there. So that's what happened. The next day, I was a junior cadet, apprentice, deck officer. So it was my job in the morning to get the crew up. So I used to go down and, call them all, the Sarangs and the carpenter. And that was part of my duty. But I couldn't get a reply from the carpenter's cabin when I knocked it. I got no answer. I went down to the engineers, went in there, I said, anything? They said, no, I haven't heard anything. So I went back up there and I knocked again. So I told the chief officer, and they got a key from the master keyboard and got in, and everything was just left tidy, but there was nothing there. But we concluded that what had actually happened was he'd been thrown overboard in the Bay of Bengal. He wouldn't have lasted long, lots of shark there. We did a reciprocal course, 180 degrees for about 12 hours with lookouts everywhere, but there was no sign of him. And when we got to Hong Kong, the Hong Kong police, in those days, they were very rough. They used, their fists and everything on them. And but they didn't give up. They didn't say they had any part in it. Yeah, there's something about that. My first trip was 1.5 years, and that was, what would that have been? That would have been 1947. That would have been February 47. And when I got back at the end of that trip, months later, many months later, I had to go to an inquest, and because I was the last one to see him alive. So I had to say what I'd seen, but didn't change anything. I'm quite sure the Indians lied in their teeth, because they were found, the stuff was still being found months later. I think they'd swallowed some and put some in tanks and so on. But they'd lied, obviously. He couldn't have done it himself. It was just impossible. But it was the engineering Sarang and his crowd. And they just kept to him. Although they were given a good hammering and pushed around a lot, they didn't give in.
It's a different world, isn't it?
It is. Well, there's a lot of that smuggling goes on. And unfortunately, he was a really nice chap, the Chinese guy. He was really, there's a tradition out there of Cantonese Chinese in India who've been handed on from father to son, and all his tools were made. How he used to work on a bench where he'd sit on it, astride with a bench going down from him, and he'd take off his shoes and he would use his feet like hands to pick up wood and line it up and hold it up, you know, and all these tools were handmade, you know, just with bits of metal in, obviously, but you know, his planes and saws and that were all handmade, handed down. Yeah.
I guess the workman's tools were a thing to pass down, but you know, through the generations, they were really valuable when machine tools weren't available.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's what, 3/4 of an hour. Time for a cup of tea. The director in charge of background music, and he'll obviously put.
Oh, I need to press the record button. Could you do it again?
We'll come around and do it again.
Thanks very much, Graham. That was really great. It's wonderful, pal.
So stop recording. Hang on.
Yeah.
Nice to talk to you too.
Yeah.
That's good, Dad.
Yes. Well.